G'day, welcome to the first alternate history with mates video. Hope you enjoy. Today I'll be exploring an Australian's wet dream. What if New Zealand had joined Australia at Federation? I'll delve through this in three sections: the historical background and how New Zealand could have joined Australia. Then I shall quickly explore what this Australia and New Zealand would look like. And finally, I'll just look at how history would have changed and how this scenario would play out. Unfortunately for IKEA though, I think they've already been tricked by my videos. The Federation of Australia occurred on the 1st of January 1901, a very convenient day to remember for all Australians. But what many don't realise besides this very happy fact is that New Zealand had been involved in these talks of federation. Indeed, so serious was this proposition of New Zealand's inclusion in the Union that the Australian Constitution actually defines New Zealand as being part of Australia, or being part of states that could join Australia, as you can see in the quote on the screen now. Additionally, New Zealand was directly tied with WA in its likelihood of joining. Given WA joined the Federation, it is not unlikely to imagine New Zealand having joined. New Zealand didn't have really any reason not to join. There weren't practical reasons. New Zealand didn't join really because they didn't really care about joining. They weren't that enthusiastic. It was more of a societal problem. They saw people from Australia as being convicts and barbarians, really. We can see an example of this Kiwi flattery on the screen right now. However, some of these societal blockers and this disconnect between mainland Australia also applied to WA. However, historically, it just seems that the other colonies, the rest of the Australian states, didn't either try hard enough, or there was never just that much of a concerted effort. However, if a couple of factors were changed, and we can see how this affects how WA got federated, we can apply the same methodology to New Zealand, how we would get New Zealand to have gotten federated. New Zealand could have joined the Union. So why did WA and other Australian colonies join Australia? Well, there were two simple reasons. Now, the first reason, which wasn't the major reason, was that free trade. Was that of free trade, that by the colonies uniting, there could be a great trade bloc, right? And they'd have more negotiating power with the British and with other nations. And this would have been a particular incentive for New Zealand if it had been pressed because of New Zealand's dominant agricultural industry, which is quite similar to Australia. So if it had unified with the other blocs, this would have allowed them to get a better agricultural deals when dealing with the British and other nations. However, the most likely way to have gotten New Zealand was for a further emphasis on defence, that united they would be strong. This was one of the main motivators that led to Federation in our times, something Henry Parkes, one of the forefathers and what is called the father of Australian Federation, particularly emphasised in many speeches, and is what motivated many of the colonies to finally join up. In our timeline, the major effect, one of them was that spurred to it, was an 1889 report by British Major General Sir J. Bevan Edwards, who said that he found the colonies did not have enough soldiers or weapons or ammunition to adequately defend themselves. Now, this helped motivate Federation in our timeline, as they were really scared because they saw this report by the Major Generals Edwards, and they knew that the only way to actually defend themselves was to unite. Now, this was particularly important because this was a turbulent time period, the 1880s, 90s, 1900s. This was a time of the great power posturing, where Germany had just emerged and was becoming quite a threat after winning the Franco-Prussian War. We also had lots of many other major powers, which were threatening Australia. Therefore, if this threat had been further emphasized to the New Zealanders, they may have joined. Furthermore, if history had been a bit different, so maybe if a minor war had broken out between the European powers, say Germany and Britain, even just a skirmish, this could have spurred New Zealand over the edge, convincing them to abandon the fact that Australia might be barbarians and convicts, but that's better than being under the fists of the Germans. Thus, if negotiators had further stressed the economic benefits with the free trade, and world events had been more convenient, so maybe a war, New Zealand could have joined Australia. Now, Australia and New Zealand are united, so what's the world like? Firstly, we would be much better at cricket and rugby. We'd probably be world number one at that, considering New Zealand and Australia's rugby and cricket teams. Otherwise, much would be the same. The Australian economy would be much larger, specifically in agriculture, which is the predominant industry of New Zealand, meaning that instead of Australia's main economy being all focused around mining and agriculture in this Australia would probably just be as influential, each one of them. Culturally, however, New Zealand would be a bit more conservative and religious, as Australia has historically been more conservative than New Zealand and has definitely been more religious. In particular, Australia was historically very sectarian religiously, just like the UK, so this would apply to New Zealand, and the importance of the church in New Zealand would be higher. So, how we see nowadays in politics, the Christian lobby group in Australia, a similar thing would occur in New Zealand nowadays. However, on the flip side, elections would possibly weigh more towards the Labour Party, as New Zealand is much more left-wing than Australia. However, given its entry into Australia, this could flip, as New Zealand would likely become more solely agricultural, as its economy making it more of a liberal state, therefore, so tending towards the National and Liberal parties in elections. In addition, New Zealand would have a lower Asian population, given Australia had the White Australia policy until 1973, changing the ethnicity of New Zealand. Overall, the Australian population would be 30 million if we take New Zealand's current numbers, so that would be an increase of 5 million. The economy would be $1.6 trillion. That would be the GDP, so that's a $200 billion increase. However, these numbers would likely be higher, with Australia likely overtaking Canada or even Brazil to become the world's 10th or 9th largest economy. And so we can imagine that Australia would be around Canada in GDP and population. So how would history have been changed? How would Australia and New Zealand being united have changed the world? Well, there wouldn't have been many differences up until the end of World War II, bar a few minor ones, such as Australia now being more significant in the world stage and getting more investment from Britain and more immigrants. In addition, it would have played a larger role in World War I and World War II. Sorry, there would have been no more Anzacs, just Aussies on the beaches of Gallipoli and Kokoda, and Australia would have played a larger role in the Pacific, given that it would have had the New Zealand manpower, so fighting Kokoda, that could have been decisive in many battles there, and it would have also been likely given more control of the colonies, so Australia was given control of things like the Solomon Islands, and New Zealand given control of Fiji during World War II, so Australia would have likely been given even more British colonies to control as they fought the Japanese. However, the major impacts of this world's change would have only been begun to be felt in the post-war period. This would be, in essence, that Australia's inclusion of New Zealand in Federation would have set precedents for Australia's development and integration of overseas territories, given New Zealand is 2,583 miles away from the Australian mainland, thus making Australia likely to go full colonial. Australia, in this world, would have kept colonial Papua New Guinea. And I bet you didn't know we had one. Anyway, in our timeline, Australia gave Papua New Guinea independence in 1975. In this timeline, this would not have occurred. Additionally, Australia would have likely annexed other British territories such as Fiji, Nauru, the Solomon Islands, undoubtedly changing Australia's culture, given Papua New Guinea has a population of 8 million. Therefore, Australia and New Zealand would have a higher Papuan and Polynesian population, changing our demographics. However, on the flip side, places such as Port Moresby and other cities in these places would likely become majority white from immigrants from immigrants, and these cities would have been newly built. Thus, there would be disparate access to resources between the white and native populations in this area, causing tension and bad inequality there. And we can see this playing out in modern day Australia between white Australians and Aboriginals. The inclusion of New Guinea to Australia would also further increase the population and the economy, as there are many untapped resources in Papua New Guinea, such as oil and gas, and Australia already has a large mining sector. And also, it would likely result in Australia having more of a manufacturing economy given the higher population, and given that the Papuan population, who would be poorer, would likely work in this sector, along with poor Eastern European and Mediterranean immigrants such as Greeks and Lebanese, meaning they would have a manufacturing sector given that there would be a poorer population, which tends to correlate with higher manufacturing. Furthermore, Australia's involvement in Papua New Guinea would result in Australian involvement in Indonesia. Now, Australia has already had a checkered past with Indonesia, technically kind of fighting a war with them during the Timor crisis between 1999 to 2005. However, in this world, Australia would get full-on involved. For example, as Australia invests more in Papua New Guinea's infrastructure and sends more population over there, it would want to secure this holding, and thus would support the Dutch more directly in the Indonesian National Revolution, which was the Indonesian War of Independence against the Dutch colony of the Dutch East Indies. Alongside the British, the Australians would fight in this war, leading to an even bloodier and longer Vietnam-style war. Already in our timeline, 100,000 civilians died, so expect this to be a bloody and atrocious war with many atrocities, and it was a deadly war even for the British, who only had minor contribution but lost 1,000 troops. This Australian involvement would alienate Australia from the USA, as the US was staunchly anti-colonial and also saw Indonesia as an important bulwark against communism, therefore alienating the two countries. This would also further lead to a breakdown between Europe, specifically the Dutch, British, and French, and the USA over colonialism, as Australia's involvement in the Dutch East Indies would further stretch out this colonial period between the Europeans. Furthermore, as time went on, the Indonesian islands would finally gain independence. However, in this world, the Javanese, who currently rule Indonesia, would not control all the disparate islands, such as West Papua or Timor or Burma, Borneo, all those places. Instead, Australia would likely annex West Papua for the resources and to secure Papua New Guinea, and the rest would likely, such as Timor, be protectorates under Australia or the British, eventually gaining independence, but always being under the political sway of the British and Australians as they seeked protection from the Javanese, who would seek to conquer them. Eventually, there would likely be a war. The Javanese would likely become communist and be supported by China and the Soviet Union in this war, which would likely happen around the 70s. Anyway, and this would lead to bloody wars. However, the Australians and British would likely win these wars, as they had naval supremacy in the region, so it would be hard for the Indonesians to land on the islands. To the modern day, Australia would likely be fighting bloody guerrilla wars across the Indonesian islands, and they would also be fighting a war in West Papua and Papua New Guinea, as there would likely be class conflicts there and racial ones too. And with the rising threat of China, this region would become hotly contested and would be a global hotspot between the competition, likely Java falling under the Chinese influence and the rest being under the Australian influence. In addition, the rise of radical Islam would pose a serious threat to Australian security. In this world, perhaps, Australia would have been the target of 9/11, given its animosity with the Javanese state, which is majority Sunni Islam, therefore being a target for the ire of Islam. Well, that's it for today, and that's what would have happened. So please like and subscribe if you liked that video.